Salam Sejahtera and good day, everybody, from here in Glasgow as well as in Malaysia and elsewhere. Esteemed discussants, and a warm welcome to our event this morning, which launches the report entitled Securing Our Future, Net Zero Emission Pathways for Malaysia. I'm Lavanya Rama Iyer, Head of Policy and Climate Change, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator today. We are really pleased to be here today following a marathon, almost 1 year of working on this report together with BCG. And so with that, let me now get our first opening remarks from our chairman of WWF Malaysia, His Highness Tunku Ali Redauddin Ibni Tunku Mukhris.
Good day and a very warm welcome to all. Today, we launched the Net Zero Report, a collaborative effort between WWF Malaysia and the Boston Consulting Group, or BCG. This important document charts a pathway to net zero emissions for Malaysia by 2050, a journey that has already begun in earnest. As a mega-diverse nation, we have maintained 50% forest cover, serving as a natural carbon sink. Our national budget for 2022 is closely aligned with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, championing recovery, resilience, and reform. The country's 5-year 12th Malaysia Plan prioritizes building a green economy and promotes sustainable living. Both the financial and business sector have also followed suit. Bursa Malaysia, our stock exchange, and other leading businesses have already pledged to become carbon neutral and adopt sustainable business practices. Incidentally, Tan Sri Wahid Omar, my fellow WWF Malaysia trustee and chairman of Bursa Malaysia, is joining us directly in Glasgow today. How then does this net zero report fit in with ongoing efforts? The report offers insight into practical ways to achieve net zero while ensuring a smooth transition for government, business, and civil society. For policymakers, the report acknowledges the significant contributions already made by the government of Malaysia and offers further ideas to develop green policies and additional ways to manage our mega-diverse landscape. For businesses, it identifies new opportunities arising from greening our world. For civil society, it ensures shared knowledge, fairness, and a smooth transition in a rapidly shifting environment. The study shows that for Malaysia to transition to net zero by 2050, an investment of less than $90 billion spanning 30 years is required. Whilst this sounds like a lot, it constitutes less than 1% of our country's GDP, or $2.7 billion per annum, and will result in the creation of up to 2.8 million new jobs. The report also lists 10 key priorities which will form the building blocks to a net zero 2050 transition. These priorities champion the green agenda whilst taking into account the financial well-being of businesses and society, acknowledging and dealing with the socio-economic impact arising from these shifts. We are grateful to have worked with BCG to develop this document. Our global partnership began in 2012, and besides WWF, BCG has partnered with the World Economic Forum and COP26 in Glasgow and developed net zero reports for China, Germany, and South Africa. Thus, our report was written with significant contextual understanding and experience, with a continued commitment to sustainability. Here is a realistic, holistic approach for Malaysia which deals with these unprecedented times. On this note, I strongly urge policymakers, captains of industry, and leaders of civil society to embrace the recommendations within its pages for a safer, better world for us and our future generations. Finally, I would like to express my gratitude to Marco Lambertini, the Director General of WWF International, and my fellow trustees and colleagues from WWF Malaysia and BCG for their support. Thank you and enjoy the event today.
Thank you very much, Tunku Ali. Sorry, it's okay. Thank you very much, Tunku Ali, for your rousing words. And now, let us hear from WWF International's Director General, Mr. Marco Lambertini, please.
A very good afternoon to all, and warm greetings from WWF International. We're very pleased to be part of this important occasion marking the launch of Malaysia's Net Zero Report by WWF Malaysia and BCG. As mentioned earlier by His Highness Tunku Ali, we live in unprecedented times. The climate crisis is leading us into a future fraught with weather extremes, food insecurity, and unimaginable biodiversity loss. The human-induced condition demands that we address the situation in the quickest way possible. And the fact is that we're not even any longer at a crossroad. We know exactly the direction we need to take and the net zero emissions future we need to achieve. We are now to act, and to act swiftly. It is imperative that every country, every company, every individual understands and charts a path to reduce our carbon footprint. And at the same time, we must support the oldest and most efficient carbon capture technology on Earth, nature. This is where the climate and nature crises meet. They are today locked into a vicious cycle where one exacerbates the other. The opportunity is to turn it into a virtuous cycle where nature-based solutions help achieve a net zero emissions future. The report confronts these issues and offers country-specific pathways to policy directions, adaptive and equitable strategies to heal our planet and carve a way of living that is sustainable, just, and amenable for us and future generations. Globally, WWF recognizes that while global warming and biodiversity loss are worldwide issues, each nation has different challenges and solutions and needs to adopt nation-specific net zero pathways. We applaud Malaysia's support for the Paris Agreement and their commitments in their national determined contributions. Globally, however, the 2021 IPCC report states that worldwide we need much more action and much faster to avoid climate catastrophe. The Net Zero report acknowledges that Malaysia already has great advantages. Abundant solar and hydropower options, more than 50% forest cover acting as a natural carbon sink and storage, and a government that is including climate-smart strategies in its development plans. The Net Zero report recommends ways to strengthen policies, build a more robust green economy, and build a net zero emissions and nature-positive society. We believe that all this is still possible. The Net Zero report is a map to that path. What is needed is continuing belief, hard work, and unwavering leadership at all levels in society, in Malaysia, in every other country around the world. It is up to us to transform this landscape of loss into a landscape of hope. Finally, understanding that we depend on a stable climate and healthy nature much more than nature depends on us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marco, for your profound words. And now with that, let us sit back and to launch the report, Securing Our Future Net Zero Pathways for Malaysia, we will have a very special short video presentation.
There's a factory that doesn't sleep. It hums and clangs constantly in the name of productivity. Its smoke seeps through the air as the ground is ripped up bare for the extended operation next year. I wonder if the birds think it's a kind of storm, one that never calms down. Call this place home.
So I hope you all enjoyed that short but very sentimental, I suppose, significant piece. I'm also pleased to let you know that that song was actually a kind donation from a US-based artist to WWF Malaysia. Thank you very much, Matt Bednarski. Now with that, you can all actually download the report using the QR code from the posters. We have some posters on the table, and you've also received the posters, so please feel free, it's now available. And this now brings me to the next item on our agenda, which is a short presentation to give you a flavor of what you can expect to find in the report. Just to let you know, about 60 people actually have been working together closely to prepare this report over a course of almost 1 year. And the core team, have been at it almost on a daily basis, including Dave, who will be presenting, and myself. And would you believe it? The first time I actually met Dave was last night in Glasgow. So one unique feature of this report is that it was prepared almost entirely through online discussions and interactions. So well and truly a COVID-19 era report, but also showing us that we can achieve whatever we want to do to meet an objective, regardless of whatever constraints there might be. With BCG, we had an ideal partner, and we had in total close to 100 engagements involving the private sector, government agencies, civil society, actors, parliamentarians, as well as the WWF network. We also engage with many experts and are truly grateful for their generous contributions in enriching the study. And we had a number of corporate contributors who kindly encouraged us with financial support, seeing the importance of undertaking a study like this for Malaysia. Thank you so very much. And all this actually came about, as you heard, based on the long-standing collaboration between BCG and WWF that Tunku Ali mentioned earlier. The objective of this study is to identify potential pathways for Malaysia, exploring the wider socioeconomic implications, and to also start building awareness and consensus with different stakeholders. This process has brought a lot of very valuable practical inputs, and we are grateful to all the stakeholders for sharing their insights, views, and concerns. The goal of this report, of course, is to prepare a study which is readily available as a resource for stakeholders in charting a transformative path for Malaysia. We also hope that it will provide useful materials for the government in making sure we meet the net zero pledge that has been announced for Malaysia. So with that, let me pass the floor to Dave Sivaprasad, Managing Partner of BCG Malaysia, to give us the highlights of the report. Dave?
Thank you very much, Lavanya, and thank you to WWF for really catalyzing this effort. It's been truly a privilege to work with this group and the broad stakeholders to offer this contribution to the country to push the agenda forward. And thank you to the wide group of public, private, and civil society stakeholders that really contributed to this over the course of the last year. So between Lavanya and myself, we will share highlights of this report over the next 15 minutes. And as Lavanya mentioned, it is now publicly available. We hope this will be a helpful reference and resource to all stakeholders as you shape your plans for transition, your contribution of transition in the country. So with that, let me start off with a few highlights of context. Talk a bit about what is technically feasible from what we know today, from the data that exists, from the technology that exists, what is possible, and what is really socio-economically and macroeconomically feasible for the country, which is really the heart of the matter, because what we know from the past few years is that there are many technology solutions that exist that can get us to net zero. We're not all there yet, but we've come a long way. What is truly challenging is to ensure a just, fair, equitable transition towards that outcome. And finally, between Lavanya and myself, we'll share 10 suggested priorities for the country, for all stakeholders take forward, and open up for discussion afterwards. So just to set the context, the momentum has really moved a lot. We've seen positive moves leading up to COP, at COP. 70% of global emissions have an ambition, have a target. We have a long way to go to achieve that, but a positive trajectory. And Malaysia has also stated a ambitious intent towards a net zero, aiming towards the 2050 horizon. And why is it important for Malaysia, besides the contribution to the global agenda and the country's resilience? From an economic standpoint, 60 to 70% of the country's exports go to countries where there is a net zero target or there is likely to be a net zero target, which will impact the economy in the long term. Now, where does Malaysia start? It starts from a position of strength. What you see here is the current footprint, as reported by Malaysia in the BUR, of where these emissions are coming from. A big part is energy and transport, but what you see is a significant natural asset of forests that provide removals for the country's overall emissions. Now, transition is complex. The end goal is net zero, but getting there implies significant transformation in the economy, in society, in the way we work, the way we live. That impacts jobs, it impacts trade, it impacts investment levels, it impacts the distribution of benefits. So many complex challenges to manage. And this is what the report sets out to do, is to lay out possible pathways where this can be managed for the benefit of all as the country transitions. What you see here is potential pathways to net zero for Malaysia. You see a wide range of getting to net zero by 2065, 2050, 2040. Let me just describe what is behind this. 2065, that number 2 line that you see, is knowing what we know today and the technologies that are in play and the technologies that are likely to be economically viable over the coming decades. If Malaysia implements all of these across sectors, this gets us towards a pathway of a net zero in the 2065 horizon. You see the other extreme of 2040, which is saying that if we had no economic constraint and if we applied everything that's feasible, technically feasible, this can get us to 2040. But really the goal of 2050 is one where you balance all the requirements of the economy, of jobs, of GDP, of households, and is it possible? And what we see is a pathway where, with significant transformation in the energy sector towards low carbon technologies, with significant transformation in mobility, low carbon transport, and this is not just EVs, this is public transport, it is shared mobility, it is using biofuels, and so on. And protecting, maintaining, and enhancing forests and the natural asset of the country. There is a pathway towards net zero. And it also includes investments in technologies that are still emerging, such as carbon capture and storage. Now, if all of these line up, there's a technical path towards zero in 2050. Now, that is what is technically possible. So what does it mean in terms of the economy and society? As you heard in the opening remarks by Tengku Ali, there's a significant amount of investment needed to achieve that. But what is notable here is, on average, we see 2 to 3% of GDP is needed for transition towards net zero globally, and this varies by country. Malaysia is significantly advantaged with its natural assets, and this is about 1% of GDP, a significant advantage to capitalize on towards transition. So that's the investment. So what does it mean for jobs, households, equitable distribution of benefits. Here we see a pathway where if all the factors line up, a positive net macro and socioeconomic path can be achieved. You see here net job creation in different pathways, and you see a positive impact on the economy and jobs in a net zero path. This is with green sectors growing and creating new sources of growth for the country, new jobs. Now, that's not all the story. As I mentioned earlier, transition is challenging. And behind this growth, there is a major transition. There's a transition of sectors that are high carbon intensive sectors that will decline over time, and new green growth sectors that will grow. So in the power sector, in oil and gas, there will be decline in economic activity and jobs over the coming decades. But at the same time, there'll be growth in green energy, in low carbon mobility, in new sources of innovation such as biofuels that will contribute to the economy. So the challenge here is really to ensure a fair, just and equitable transition where the jobs of the future are planned for and steered. There are appropriate levels of social safety nets and support for those impacted by transition, and ensuring that this is fair and equitable as we go through the coming decades. So that's a picture of the economy. There's also a picture of equitable distribution across the country. Now, this is relevant for every country going through transition. This is an illustration for Malaysia, where there is a pathway to spread benefits geographically across different states, with steering of investment, steering of economic activity, playing towards the natural advantages of the country, where certain states have advantage to high renewable energy. Certain states have a manufacturing base that can be retuned. Certain areas have natural advantages such as hydro, which can contribute to green hydrogen, as an example. So there are many areas where, with steering that transition, an equitable outcome can also be achieved. Now, finally, from a socio-economic standpoint, what does it mean for households? What does it mean for individuals? And what we see is that there is a path. There is a path where, with the adoption of technologies that are getting economically competitive, as green premiums get compressed in places such as the energy system, in transport, that household expenditure can positively be impacted in some areas. An example is low carbon transport, where the expectation is over the next 10 years, the total cost of ownership in electric vehicles are expected to be more competitive than the traditional internal combustion engine. So these are positive impacts for households. Now, that's not the only story. There will be areas where goods and services prices may increase, with investments needed to fund decarbonization of supply chains. But from our estimates, these can be in the range of 3, 4, 5% across various supply chains. So when you put it all together, there is a pathway where households are not deeply negatively impacted. There is positive benefit, there's some cost increase, but overall, there's a path that is feasible where where individuals are not adversely impacted by transition. So that lays a picture of what's technically feasible, what's socioeconomically possible, and what does that mean in terms of, so what do you do about this? Well, what are the priorities the country can take forward? And there are 10, and between Lavanya and myself, we'll share with you a bit of the highlights behind these 10, and there's much more to be said about this, and we encourage you to read the report. Let me start off with the first 5. The first is really protecting and enhancing the natural asset of the country, the forest, the biodiversity, not just protecting it, but really enhancing it and growing that natural competitive advantage. The second is decarbonizing the power and energy system. And this is not just renewables, it is also investments in the grid, it's storage, it is demand management, it's energy efficiency. There are many factors that really transform the energy system of the future, and we need to do all of it to transform. And that fits also to the third point on low carbon transport. Now, low carbon transport is not all about electric vehicles, but it certainly is a big part. And to fully capitalize on the advantage of electric vehicles in the system, you need to have a decarbonized grid. So 2 and 3 go together quite hand in hand. But to expand on 3, as I said, it's not just electric vehicles, it's also shared mobility, it's investment in public infrastructure and public transport, it is playing to the natural advantage of the country in biofuels, it is application of new technologies such as hydrogen for heavy vehicles, so a number of areas that underpin 3. The fourth is really to price carbon in the appropriate way for the country and the economy. And this is truly an important foundation that we believe is essential to steer the economy towards a transition. And with a price on carbon, you can start to mobilize the market, mobilize the allocation of resources, both capital and talent, towards the green sectors that will matter in the long term. And the fifth, you saw a large number, 90 billion over 3 decades, mobilizing all sources of capital to fund this transition. That's private sector capital, it is public sector, it's blended finance, but it is creating the conditions where you create transparency for investors to feel confident to invest, creating platforms where you can match projects to capital, and really creating the ecosystem around finance that will enable the funding of transition. With that, I'll hand to Lavanya to speak about the other 5 priorities.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dave. And just to let you know, could we have the slides, please? Yeah, just to let you know that you saw the first 3 priorities. They are somewhat connected, and for the first time, we actually got in this annual budget allocation from our Ministry of Finance to undertake, as seed funds, to undertake a project that looks into enhancing forests, reforestation, and at the same time growing biofuels, so that appropriate biofuels, so that that can also serve as an alternative to fossil fuels. So, sort of many things coming together, and we found that very, very encouraging. So thank you very much to the Ministry of Finance. May we have the slides, please? Could we have the slides, please? Thank you. And so the next one, number 6, is to spur innovation and scale high potential technologies. So, as I mentioned, there's the seed fund that has been given. There is also, during the course of our engagement, we came across interesting ideas. We came across this company, Next Generation Oil, that wants to create biofuels using 3rd generation biofuels, which is algae, crude algae oil. So with not only civil society, but also the corporate stakeholders and the government, that we must make sure that what we are doing in pursuing, mitigation pathways does not end up causing other problems to communities, other environmental problems. So we really need to take make sure that we, from a human capital perspective as well, so that needs to be looked into as well, reskilling the workforce. And then behavioral change and consumer action. Here we really need to step up and push the Climate Action Council and the private sector. There have been a group of CEOs who have come together to advance, climate action within the corporate sector. So it's very promising, but I'd just like to also say that, the momentum is here. We really need to keep pushing, and we hope, the findings of this study will encourage people to, do more. I'd just like to highlight one more thing, that in looking at all of this, we also need to, look at it from an equity perspective. So we have tried to analyze, look, what Malaysia's fair contribution into the global agenda to keep to 1.5 should be. We have applied this climate equity reference calculator in finding that number. It's developed by the Stockholm Environment Institute, and we find that our net zero pathway, our ambition, is very much in line with what our fair contribution should be to the agenda. Next, please. Now, we have spoken a lot about mitigation, but this is just to say that the study report recognizes that adaptation is equally important. It's an equal footing. You can't do one without the other. They are both intricately linked, and both have to happen at the same time. And we also heard that as we were talking to all the stakeholders, be it corporates, be it the civil society, government, that they see that too, that the risks of climate change are becoming more and more apparent, and companies and civil society are asking for more action to make sure that we are resilient and can adapt to climate change. So the report, although is not focused, our scope did not extend broadly to also include an in-depth look at adaptation at this stage. We do strongly emphasize that adaptation is as important as mitigation. Okay, next please. So ultimately, what we are looking at is a future which is transformed for the country. So you have all these things coming together to shape a Malaysia, and we hope also a blueprint that other countries can adopt, that that show you that this is possible, this is feasible. There are many things that come into play. We have to look at them concretely, holistically, but it can be done, and a future that we can map out with circular economy, with clean transportation, with clean energy. Why not? Yeah. Next, please. Dave, back to you.
Just to wrap up, what we shared is highlights of this report. We really encourage you to download it and use it as a reference and a resource. Hopefully this can contribute to the plans and actions that public, private, civil society stakeholders can take as you move this ambition forward. And just to re-emphasize a point on civil society and consumer action that Lavanya mentioned, by taking action in the way you choose to move, mobility, how you manage your energy, you can impact up to 20% of this agenda as an individual, collectively. So this is truly one that all of us can shape.
And before we end the presentation, we'd really like to give our sincere gratitude to these contributors who have made the study possible, supporting the BCG investment and WWF investment into this. So we have Amundi, Bursa Malaysia and Tenaga Nasional as lead contributors. We have co-lead contributors, CIMB Bank, DG and UMW, and also co-contributors, Hong Leong Bank, RHB Bank, and Public Islamic Bank. So really, thank you so much for your encouragement and for your contribution and for believing in this path, in this effort. So this is the QR code, and we will maybe leave this on the screen for a while, for a short while. We can take it down, and we will move now to our next exciting session, which is to hear reflections from our esteemed discussants. We have 3 esteemed discussants here today. And to start, we will have Tan Sri Abdul Wahid Omar, who is the chairman of Bursa Malaysia. He is a very well-known corporate figure. He's been very extensively involved in many sectors and organizations. And amongst his many achievements, he's also now a fellow at the Oxford Islamic Center. So he's kindly driven up all the way here to be with us. in person today. So Tan Sri, thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Lavanya. I must say it's a privilege and honor to be here in person at COP26. I think it's nothing like seeing things in action, and thank you for inviting me to be here. Now, if I may, a lot of grounds have been covered by Lavanya and Dave. Perhaps on my part, I'll make 3 comments. First, in respect of the government's commitment towards net zero. Second, in terms of the corporate sector's response and the role in moving towards net zero. And the third, in terms of the role that Bursa Malaysia is playing towards net zero. Now, back to the first one, I must say that the credit must be given to the government for making this commitment for the country to move towards net zero. And I think this, until recently, there have been a lot of conversations whether will the government be prepared, will there be enough political will and courage to truly commit towards net zero. And I think, alhamdulillah, when the Prime Minister tabled the 12th Malaysia Plan in Parliament in September, he made that commitment for Malaysia to be a net zero nation as early as 2050. And beyond that, there's also that commitment to decarbonize the energy sector, and in particular, doing away with coal or phasing out coal gradually. And until recently, some of you may not be aware that there were supposed to be 3 new coal power plants totaling 3,500 megawatts to be commissioned in 2031, 2034, and 2037, and that is now off the table, I think, which is actually great. So this report prepared by BCG and WWF will be very helpful in not just giving the government some ideas about the potential pathways, but I think more importantly to give the whole country, the corporate sector, the public, a good idea about where we are currently in our greenhouse gas emissions and how do we get there towards achieving net zero, the various pathways, as well as understanding what are the consequences and unintended consequences. Lavanya and Dave spoke about the impact on the employment and so on. They need to retrain human capital to prepare for a net zero world, as well as the investment opportunities. Now, as Dave mentioned, and even Tengku mentioned in the opening remarks, moving towards net zero for Malaysia will require investments of between 350 billion ringgit to 450 billion ringgit. So that's about $90 billion or so. On an annual basis, it represents about 0.8%. So that means in today's current prices, based on our GDP of about 1.5 trillion ringgit, so you're talking about 12 to 15 billion ringgit kind of quantum. Now, I had the privilege of interviewing the finance minister early this week at our Invest Malaysia event in Kuala Lumpur. And when I posed the question whether that figure of 0.8% to 1% of GDP is doable, and I think he said yes, it's certainly doable. So I think it's highly encouraged. So the fact that we can quantify, it gives you the courage to know that we know how to get there, inshallah. Now, that brings me to the second part about the corporate sector. Now, when it comes to movement towards net zero, it is actually part and parcel of the global ESG movement. So this is actually the E part. And the others being the social and governance. Now, we all know that in the corporate world, there's a global movement towards sustainability. And you have, for example, a group of institutional fund managers and asset owners that have signed the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, UNPRI. So these are more than 4,000 fund managers and asset owners with assets totaling more than 100 trillion US dollars, making that commitment not to invest in any company that has got little regard towards sustainability. On top of that, you have a group of bankers that have signed the principles for responsible banking. They say that they're not going to provide any funding, debt funding for projects that are not sustainable. And likewise, group of insurance companies that have pledged as part of the UN principles for sustainable insurance, which will result in them only underwriting projects that are sustainable. And even if they do, for those which are not sustainable, there'll be huge premium to be paid. So the case for corporates not to embrace, or the case for corporates to embrace sustainability is very clear. It's not about the nice to have, it's a matter of survival, because if they don't, they're not going to get the equity or that funding, they're not going to get insurance cover, or will have to pay a huge premium for that, and they're not going to get human capital necessary to drive their business, because the young generation today, they're very conscious about companies that are sustainable. And the last part also is about the ability to sell their products and being part of the global supply chain, because if you're not sustainable, you will not be able to participate in the global supply chain. So it is a matter of survival indeed. So when we talk about the corporates embracing sustainability, apart from that being a requirement under the new Malaysian Code on Corporate Governance that was issued by the Securities Commission in April 2021, the case for ESG is actually very clear. And so this report that we have, it is great. Number one, we actually got the whole corporate sector to participate in this. So apart from those who did contribute in terms of funding, there's a lot more entities that had contributed in terms of the content, the technical content input, and I think it's something which we appreciate. And this include people from Climate Governance Malaysia and the CEO Action Network and the various members who have chipped in and participated in various dialogue. This report will also give courage to the corporates to know that there's actually clear movement to decarbonize our energy sector, and that will help them in terms of their commitment towards net zero, particularly when it comes to scope 2, the embedded carbon in the energy mix, if I may. The third part, if I may, Lavanya, is about the role of Bursa Malaysia. So wearing my hat as the chairman of Bursa Malaysia, being a frontline regulator and the exchange operator, naturally, we have always encouraged all the public listed companies to embrace sustainability in their strategy and in their business operations. We have launched the FTSE for Good Bursa Malaysia Index back in 2014, and it's been 7 years since then, and the number of constituents has grown, has tripled to 76 as today. And since then, we have also launched the FTSE for Good Bursa Malaysia Sharia Index, where not just being sustainable but also Sharia compliant. We are starting off with 54 counters at the moment, and obviously the idea would be to grow this number significantly into the future. Now, beyond that, we also honored to have been given the mandate by the government to work on the development of the voluntary carbon market and leading up to the development of the domestic emission trading scheme. As mentioned earlier, carbon pricing is actually very, very important in order to mobilize capital towards green projects, and that's something that we're actually working on. And I guess thank you to the government, to Minister of Finance, the EPU, the Ministry of Environment and Water, and the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources, and the rest of the government for their trust in Bursa Malaysia in working on this important national initiative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tan Sri, and thank you for telling us, the amazing amount of things that are actually already underway in Malaysia, which we can spur further with these kind of ideas that we see in the report. Thank you. Now, I would like to invite Vanessa, please. We have Vanessa Perez-Herrera, who is our very inspiring deputy leader of our climate and energy practice. And in this role, she has worked on net zero carbon pathways, policy and coalition formulation. So she is an environmental economist focusing on international climate policy and economics, and served as the Deputy Policy Director at the Mexican Ministry of Environment before joining WWF in 2002. So Vanessa, we'd love to hear your views on your reflections on what you just saw about the study. Maybe 5 minutes, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lavanya, and first of all, it's a pleasure to be with my peer panelists. The first reflection I will say is that I think this study is trying to bring us back to this concept of low emission development pathways, right? Or what we used to call the LEDs. And I think it is very important that the social development piece that has been a little bit lost in this momentum that has been driven by net zero and the net zero pledges and so on, that is not lost. I mean, at the end of the day, what we want to see is social development, and what we want to see is to characterize social development. And so I think for me, that is one of the key highlights that I would like to say. I would love to see similar analysis for other countries that take into account similar types of variables. I think that in that social development side of things, we must put also a lens in terms of distributional impacts. So distributional effects, that's definitely the other, I would say, dilemma of the current society, in inequality, and what does that mean? The second thing I'd like to emphasize is the balance that you have between decarbonizing the energy sector and then, of course, using nature-based solutions. And it's not an either-or. It's an additional, right? So it's both of them and alongside, and because they're so important. And I think that must cut across the noise that we are seeing out there, and definitely not including as an either-or. We have to do deep decarbonization to its highest potential. And within that, within the decarbonization of the energy sector, something that I found very, very interesting is, of course, the mention of the transport. And I think that one, that has still things to unpack, because if we think about decarbonization, not only in terms of the amount of jobs and then the overall GDP or economic indicators, we also have to see what are the impacts of the deep decarbonization in the creation of public goods, right? I think the creation of public goods is a very important, and that is very important both on the energy side when you talk about public transport and public electric transport. And I don't exactly know the Malaysian economy too well to understand the urbanization trends, but I would think that urbanization trends are following what we're seeing in the world. And so thinking about that, we have to think about habitable cities planned for people. And I think the public goods and the public services side of things are something that we must emphasize quite clearly. And the last bit probably that I would say is on the credibility side of things. I think the net zero concept is facing a lot of momentum on the one hand side, but also a lot of resistance, because it is seen as a way of greenwashing, or on the one hand side kicking the can down the line, or just doing an either or type of strategy. I would definitely wish we could get to zero carbon by 2050 at the world. Of course, it's not something that I don't definitely. I mean, that should be the goal, a zero carbon. But and it's not because net zero. It's trying to emphasize the role of nature as an alternative. It's just because it's the best scenario that we have at the moment to achieve 1.5. But so on the credibility side, I think that the numbers are very important. So they must be additive numbers like you have in this study. But I also think that moving forward, I do think that something that was yesterday outlined in a panel that I was participating on science and the 1.5 degrees, the net zero pathways definitely have a trajectory, and that the trajectory of the 2030 must be an information for the net zero pathway. So the net zero pathways might not be like that, but should have some kind of deepening in the very short term. So I think compatibilizing the 2030 and the needs of science of the 2030 with the 2050, it's something we have to do in order to ensure that this is a credible pathway. So I very much thank the opportunity, Lavanya. I want to thank the work of the Malaysian office is fantastic, and your work. And also combining the adaptation side of things. So that's why also nature-based solutions is so important that it gets mentioned in the text today, because it's not only about nature for achieving the 1.5 degree or maintaining it alive, but it's also the array of benefits of nature-based solutions to adaptation, to social development, for water security, for food security. So I very much thank the opportunity to be here and congratulate, thank you BCG for your support on this, and over back to you, Lavanya.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, and yeah, thank you for emphasizing that nature-based solutions is about getting multiple benefits. Now it gives me great pleasure to invite Farhana Syukur, who is a representative from the Malaysian Youth Delegation. She's a member of the Malaysian Youth Delegation, and organization that's dedicated to raising awareness about climate change in Malaysia and making their voices heard in institutional conversations about international and local climate policies. She successfully organized a conference of youth in Malaysia, a local version of the event first organized to help young people understand and experience UNFCCC processes and policies. Congratulations. Better preparing them for their future participation in the COPs. Over to you, Farhana.
Thank you, Ms. Lavanya. So, Assalamualaikum and greetings. I am Farhana Syukur. I am a youth climate advocate from Malaysia. So, the topic of net zero is a kind of talking about the future and about the next generation. So the decisions of the past must also be taken into consideration, and we must also learn from our mistakes and others. And it goes without saying that we are living in a climate crisis, and we need to make serious, decisive, and concrete decisions. And making the decision to net zero is a must. So the move to a just transition is a must, and everyone ought to be on board. The path to decarbonization must be just, whereby the people who make it happen, the workers, are protected financially and socially. We should not hide behind the idea of just transition when business as usual is still ongoing. It is deadly for us, and it's deadly for the planet. So the meaning of just transition would be different based on countries, even states, because it is contextualized. In the sense that the meaning of the needs of transitioning to net zero would be different from cities to rural areas. So furthermore, affordability is also part of being just. So net zero is interdependent of goals between climate perspectives and the just transition perspectives. And recognizing the need to achieve a net zero mission, there is a need to call for the deep decarbonization, starting with the energy and transportation sector. We need a rapid, deep decarbonization of the energy sector. During the pandemic and the prolonged lockdowns, we have seen the increased reliance on energy to give us the ability to continue studies, to connect with loved ones, and to even work from home. And so this increased need should be a reason to explore and develop renewable energy. Also, it is worth pointing out the energy poverty that still exists in both cities and rural areas. So it became more apparent during the lockdowns and during the pandemic. And the benefits of access to energy would help with livelihoods. In the transportation sector, we need efficient transportation that has a last mile connection. It should also be inclusive in that it should be disability friendly. This would obviously lessen the dependence on personal vehicles, and it would reduce the traffic congestion in cities, and I would know because I live in KL. So secondly, there is a need to call for better climate governance. So climate change impacts everything in every sector. So therefore, climate change should be mainstreamed in all sectors of the economy and beyond. Beyond meaning well-being, mental health, personal health. And because it impacts everyone, climate change should be integrated and addressed at an interministerial level to promote collaboration and flow of information, especially the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Youth and Sports, the Ministry of Environment and Water, and the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources in Malaysia. The private sector, it's going to be a bit hard to say this, but the private sector should be accountable for all their emissions that they're emitting as well. For us to transition to a sustainable future, companies should not have the excuse to pave the way to sustainability. And finally, the last call to action would be the need for climate justice in the form of climate finance. Countries in the Global South prioritize socioeconomic growth, and with reason. However, it should not come at the cost of its people's well-being. It is easy for countries in the Global North to exert pressure and demand for other countries to be more sustainable because they have passed where the Global South is still struggling. The push to adopt net zero by 2050 shifts the goalpost from the Paris Agreement. This new goal is anti-equity and is against climate justice. The new goal of net zero emissions for all countries by 2050 will further intensify the existing inequities between developed and developing countries. So for the Global South to transition to net zero, the Global North should be fair and provide assistance, financial, technological, and capacity. So world leaders and leaders in the industries have gathered here today to discuss climate action. I trust I speak for young people everywhere today when I demand for urgent and accelerated decarbonization, one that is inclusive, transparent, and consistent. The decisions we take today must be reflective of the world that is safe and healthy for young people and their future generations to thrive and inherit in years to come. World leaders must live up to their promises to reduce global emissions in recognition that climate resilience and disaster risk reduction are vital to reduce the existential stress on vulnerable people and families everywhere. Terima kasih and thank you.
Thank you so much, Farhana, for your passionate statement on what the youth need us to do today. So with that, unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we can't take any questions, but please feel free to engage with us. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Thank you to the discussants, Tan Sri Wahid, to Vanessa, who's had to leave, and Farhana. Thanks, Dave, BCG. Your partnership has been amazing. We have all really enjoyed the journey, the ride, and we continue to hope we can work together to push this further. And also, thank you very much to all those who have been working very hard behind the scenes. This would not have been possible without your tireless efforts. And finally, to our wonderful steering committee, chaired by Dato' Brendan So, the chairman and board of trustees of WWF Malaysia, our CEO, Sophia Lim, and conservation director, Dr. Henry Chan. all who provided such useful guidance and support, and of course the team, the BCG and WWF team that worked together. And I would like to end by saying a very special thank you to Tan Sri Wahid Omar, who has been encouraging us, who is our trustee and has been constantly supporting us. So thank you very much, everyone.